So what you're seeing behind me is a clearing that they're making room for more homes in my neighborhood. Now just a couple weeks ago, this whole place was just littered with cutoffs from trees, from branches, and from parts that they couldn't use. And rather than trying to salvage them, they basically run them through a chipper and dump them at the dump 4 miles that way. It's really kind of sad. So just in the next 3 to 4 years, they plan on clearing enough land in my area to put up 5,000 or 6,000 new homes. That's a lot of leftover wasted material. So I had this idea for what I'm calling the urban sawmill. It's this miniature sawmill I'm making out of 1-inch square tubing that's got a box on one side and 2 runners behind it. It's pretty simple. Now I plan on using a beam saw for the cutting part of the sawmill. Now a beam saw is simply a chainsaw attachment that you can attach to a circular saw. Here I've got a Protzi beam saw attached to my Bosch circular saw. Now that's cutting through 4-inch cherry with no trouble at all, so I'm hoping at this point that it's going to work. I don't really know for sure. Now I made the big part, or the frame with the runners, on Saturday on a live hangout on YouTube on my second channel, and now I have to come back and add the track to it and the saw carriage. So I welded a square together that basically sits between the 2 tracks, and then welded some plates to that so it had something to ride on. Now I'm just going steel to steel with this one. I may add wheels to this later, but for now I just wanted to test it out, get the saw mounted, and see how it worked. And after getting the frame all welded up, it actually worked really well. Now I get excited about a project, you can pretty much guaranteed I'm going to be up late in the shop working on it. And I should point out that I've got a metal cutting chop saw in the shop, and I have a metal cutting bandsaw, which made this project go a little bit quicker. It could absolutely be done with an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel. It would be a lot more work. And it occurred to me during this process that this could be done out of wood. I could build one out of wood just as easily as I could build one out of steel and take a 1.5 sheets of plywood and a couple of 2x4s. So you can look for that in an upcoming video. Now what I'm working on right here is a couple of towers. I'm basically going to mount the bed of the circular saw to a box that's going to slide up and down in between these 2 towers, and that's how I'm going to adjust the height of the blade that's making the cut so I can get different thicknesses. Now before I did that, I needed to drill a hole in one of the bottom pieces that's going to act as a pivot, and it'll make sense here in a minute. Now before I weld these 2 towers together to make one unit, I need to have a way to move the saw up and down that tower. And to do that, I'm welding together some 3/4 inch tubing, and it's pretty important that this stays as flat and as square as possible, because this is going to run up and down a track between the 2 towers. Now to mount the saw, I'm just going to mark out some positions where I can drill right through the steel tubing and then through the bed of the saw, and then I can just run some bolts in, and this will secure the saw to the sawmill. Now with the frame made and the weld sanded down, I fit it in the track just to make sure it would slide up and down nice and neat, and it did. So now I'm going to weld this track to the 2 towers that I made earlier, and then off camera I actually welded the rest of the frame together, or the rest of the tower together, with the track or mounting bracket inside of it. Now we talked about earlier having a pivot point, and that's where the pivot point is right there in the background. You can see that bolt that's coming through. Now the reason I did that is so when I mount the saw, I can actually pivot the whole tower, which will make the cut shallower. So if I don't have to take a full pass through the log at one time, if I'm cutting into hardwood or something that's a little bit more difficult, I can just pull the frame out and it'll make a half depth cut through, and then I can pull it back and push the frame back into position and finish the cut all the way through. Now right here at this point, I realize there's a design change that I could make that would make this a lot easier to build. But I've decided at this point I'm just going to hold off, finish up the way I have it, test the saw to make sure it's all going to work. And in a later video, I'll make some design changes and show you guys all the improvements that I had planned. So knowing I was going to make some changes, I kind of got lazy at this point. I just drilled a hole right through the top of the tower and welded a piece of threaded rod to the frame, and then added a nut. This way I could move the saw up and down with my DPT wrench. And after that, I drilled some holes directly through the bed of the saw and then bolted the saw to the frame. Now one last thing, the saw blade moved a little bit. It had a little bit of a wiggle on it, and that's just because the angle adjustment on the skill saw wasn't real strong. So I added a piece of wood to the saw itself and then to the bed of the saw, and that stabilized the blade really well. Now the last part to do is set it up and cut some material. At this point I'm pretty nervous. I'm hoping that the saw is strong enough to cut through some material, and I actually had a tree left over from the hurricane we had here a few weeks back, and it's just a branch, a real gnarly one that I was going to test it on. So like the name implies, the urban mini sawmill, this is meant to be a benchtop type of sawmill. You can actually set it up on some sawhorses, and I set mine up on the three-legged sawhorses I built in a video last week. Then clamped everything down, and I have some ideas for making clamping devices for clamping the log in that are fully adjustable, but at this point I didn't go that far. I'm just using some 2x4s to mount the material, and I will show you those clamping devices in an upcoming video. So I set the log in place, and because these don't have oilers, the bar chain doesn't have an oiler on it, I'm using WD-40 at the point. I'm in the finished version of this saw. I will actually have a drill-powered oil dispenser, so the bar chain, the chainsaw will have its own oiler. Now these saws are designed to cut, through 12, 14 inches of material without really needing the oiler on it, but because I'm using it for a full-blown sawmill, it needs to have some kind of lubrication system. So we'll talk more about that down the road. So after cutting off the piece of material that I left too long and got in the way of the track system, I stopped and recorded a little video for my Instagram and fired up the saw. And I have to tell you, I was super impressed with its performance. We're going to see more here. Right now it's 4 times speed, and it was cutting through this stuff. There's 8 inches like it was nothing. It had no problem at all cutting right through it. So this is a hardwood. I'm not exactly sure what species it is. It's a decorative hardwood that we had in our yard, and I messed around with cutting it at half depth and at a full depth, and to be honest, the speed there wasn't enough difference in the speed. Like, in other words, I couldn't cut twice as fast with it at half depth, so it just made more sense to cut it at full depth. I want to give a special thank you to Matthias Wandel for actually sending me an email kind of making some suggestions, and he sent me a link to a video where he did some experiments, and I'll link that video down below. It actually helped quite a bit in this build, and he was the one that inspired the swing arm mounting system so I could cut at half depth. Now I think when I'm cutting like in something like oak or hickory with a little bit larger log, that having that half depth capacity is going to really come in handy. So what you're seeing right now is actual speed. This footage hasn't been sped up at all. I wanted to do a shot so you guys could see it working just like it normally works, without all the fancy video editing. Now at the largest point there, I was cutting through just shy of 9 inches of material, and it did not even bother the saw at all. It cut right through it. It is important to keep this lubed, so I think adding the bar chain oiler to it will actually increase its performance down the road as well. Also, I would like to mention that you can get different blades for this. You can put a longer blade on it and a rip chain on it, which I think would also improve its performance as well. But I gotta tell you guys, I am ridiculously happy with the performance of the saw. I really like the way the system works. There are some improvements that I can make to it to make it perform even better, and I'll be doing that, like I said before, in an upcoming video. That's still a few weeks away. In the meantime, I've got some great videos coming out. I've got a project with Carl Jacobson coming out in a couple of days, and a homemade bench vise coming out this weekend. So make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. We've got some fun stuff coming down the pipe. So if you're not comfortable with metalworking, don't sweat it. In a week or so, I'll have a wood version out of my urban mini sawmill. I'm really excited to try that on for size and see how it works out. Now, I will mention that when I have the final version of both the wood version and the steel version done, there'll be free plans available on my website for both of those. It worked. It worked really well. I was really impressed with the performance. The beam cutter, the Protzi beam cutter, did phenomenal. The Bosch saw, plenty of power to cut right through this. I think the largest cut probably about 9 inches. Largest point is about 9 inches. But my concerns are all laid to rest. I have no doubt that this thing will mill up a 12-inch or 10-inch log without any trouble whatsoever. A few changes to make, and I'll have that out in a couple of weeks. I ordered some parts already and some plate steel, so I have to wait for that to come in, and when those things come in, I'll make those changes and we'll do a couple more serious test runs with it. I do want a quick shout out to BP Way, Fine Tool, sawblade.com, and Woodpecker Tools and Bell Forest Products for jumping on board with the Izzy Swan's Toolmasters Association. There'll be more to come about that in future videos. And you know what, guys, thanks for watching. Thrilled to pieces that the mini urban sawmill is performing as well as it has. I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled. Protzi beam saw, great job. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one.